just the valley of Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter and the valley of burning. The Babylonians, when they conquered Jerusalem, they threw all the Jewish corpses down in there and burnt them. And it became known after the rebuilding of Jerusalem as the most horrible place on earth. Is this interesting to you? And therefore, Jews would avoid the spot. Pious Jews wouldn't come near it. This deep canyon down there, just a crevasse. Nobody knew how deep it was, but they all knew what was down there. And in the New Testament, Jesus refers lots of times, he's not talking about our idea of hell, but rather a symbol for it. Gehenna. One or two times in Luke, including this time, it's not Gehenna that Jesus uses, but the word Hades. That comes from Greek mythology. Remember, Luke was a Greek. And in this Greek mythology, Hades was the name of a god, the god of death, Hades or Hades. And Greek people believed when a man died, they would put 2 pennies on his eyes, on his corpse, and bury him because he needed those 2 pennies. That's because his spirit would rise up and take those pennies and go and go down steps that would open for him down into the underworld, the realm of King Hades, the god of the underworld. When you got down at the bottom of those steps, they folded up and disappeared behind you so you couldn't get back up. Only 2 men in Greek mythology ever made their way back up. One was Hercules, the other one was Orpheus. But you'd get down there and you find yourself on the edge of a dark flowing river, the river Styx. And you'd have to have your 2 pennies because the ghostly boatman Charon would come rowing over to you. And you'd have to have the 2 pennies to pay him to get you across the river. And then you'd be delivered on the other side to the palace of King Hades. And he would judge you and rule which part of his realm you would go to. If you were good, you'd be sent to the Elysian fields, which is a heavenly paradise. If you were brave in battle, you'd live on top of a mountain rising from the Elysian fields. If you were a bad man, you'd be sent the other way down the river to a place called Tartarus. And that was where the river pours into this lake of fire. And in the middle of the lake of fire, there's like a volcano, and the very worst people would be carried through the fire by demons up and cast into this volcano that they called the bottomless pit of fire. Now, that was the Greek idea. It came into the Jewish idea. The Sadducees didn't accept any of those terms, but Pharisees did. Now, Jesus is referring here to those ideas. Now, I'm not saying whether there's an everlasting hell of eternal conscious torment or not. I'm not even arguing that. I just want you to know that Jesus is using terms that really speak to the deepest emotions, fears, and wonders of the people he's talking to. On one hand, Lazarus is in the bosom of Abraham, where every pious Jew would like to be, somewhere in the presence of God with Abraham. And this rich man is cast down into, well, he's in torments. He lifts up his eyes. He can look across the crevasse or the river Styx or the lake of fire or whatever you want to call it from whatever mythology and ideology. But he's able to look and see Lazarus afar off in Abraham's bosom. Afar off, and yet not so far that it can't be seen and not so far that he can't be heard by Abraham. Next verse. Next verse, please, Brother Chris. And he cries out to Abraham and he says, Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Now, what is that mercy? Does Abraham have power to stop the fire from burning? Does he believe Abraham has power to get him out of there? He doesn't really ask for that. What he asks for is a kindness from Lazarus now. Send Lazarus that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. Now, it's this story that Jesus tells. He makes it sound not just like a parable, even though he does use the mythological reference to hell, the Greek word Hades. He's telling it as though it's something that really happened. Now, how would Jesus know this had happened? Well, he's Jesus. He sees things in the spiritual world as well as the temporal world, yes, of course. But he's telling this to people who are standing back there saying, well, how would you know what happened to somebody after they died? Well, Jesus doesn't answer that question to them if they're asking it, but surely they were thinking it. And Abraham, in Jesus' story, responds to the rich man and says, son, wow, here's this rich man in hell, this sinner who ends up in hell, and Abraham still calls him son. This means that this man was a Jew, a child of Abraham through the flesh, and yet that didn't keep him out of hell. Just being, John the Baptist had told them that. How will you escape hellfire just by saying you're children of Abraham? That won't get you out. Jesus had also asked the same thing of people on another occasion. Now here, Luke has Jesus telling this story. I don't know why this story isn't found in Matthew, Mark, and John, but Luke has Jesus telling it. Abraham says to him, son, remember that you in your lifetime received many good things, while Lazarus in his lifetime received evil things. Now, the first has become last. The top has become the bottom, a reversal of eternal fortunes. Now he is comforted, Lazarus is comforted, but you, rich man, are tormented. Now there we get this picture that should be very striking to all of us. We have a brief life and a long eternity. How we live our brief life will forsage and cause how we will live in eternity. He's comforted, and you, rich man, are tormented. Next verse. And beside all this, Abraham keeps talking, between you and us, there's a great gulf fixed, a wide cavern, a rift that no one can cross over, so that they which would like to leave my presence and go over there to do something for you, they cannot. Wow. I don't know how I can enjoy heaven if I'm looking down there and seeing perhaps former loved ones and friends and acquaintances twisting in the flames of hell, undying. I just can't, it boggles my mind. I don't even try to explain the idea. But it bothers me. How can you enjoy heaven? I imagine that if I were in the bosom of Abraham and saw an acquaintance down there, I would want to go. I'd be Lazarus. Can I get a cup of water and take it to that poor fellow? Abraham says, even if you want to go over there, you cannot. Neither can they, who are down there, pass up to us that would come to us from down there, from thence. Next verse. Then the rich man in flames said, well, then I pray you, therefore, Father Abraham, that if you can't send Lazarus down here to help me, send him back to life on earth, even briefly. let him rise from the dead. Send him to my Father's house. Next verse. Can you just do that? Because I've got 5 brothers, and I would love for him to be sent to testify to them. Boy, I feel the touch of God. To testify to my 5 brothers who are living the way I lived and had the attitude I had. Can Lazarus go and warn them lest they also come into this place of torment? Next verse. And Abraham says to him, your 5 brothers, they've got Moses, they've got the prophets, they've got the scriptures read to them. That means that it's a Jewish family. The scriptures are taught to them in synagogue and at temple. They've got the scriptures. Let them hear them. Now, this is fascinating to me. God says, my word is my testimony. If you won't hear my word, you won't hear anybody else. If you're not interested in my word, if you don't ponder my word, you're not going to listen to anybody that gives you their testimony. You'll scoff at it. Remember, these Jews had just scoffed at Jesus. That's why he's telling this story. They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. Next verse. And the man in flames says, oh no, Father Abraham, but if one went unto them from the dead, if one rises from the dead, that'll be testimony to them. They'll repent if someone rises from the dead. What's Jesus setting up here? His resurrection is the great testimony of who he is. His resurrection from the dead is the great testimony of his message. Rich man senses this down in flames. If one would to rise from the dead, they would repent. Next verse. And he said to them, no, sir, if they don't hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rose from the dead. Now, that's the story of Lazarus and the rich man. Few questions. Number one, why do we have a name? There's only one other fellow in the Bible or in the New Testament by that name, and that's the brother of Mary and Martha. Crossed the Jordan over there to Jerusalem, about a 2-day journey walking. A suburb of Jerusalem is the little town of Bethany where Lazarus and his 2 sisters live. Now, St. John has told us that Jesus is in Perea over here for a number of weeks. And it's probably while he's there that he takes his 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John, up to the top of the mountain, and they see him transfigured, and Moses and Elijah, who both disappeared on that mountain, appear again and then disappear. But while they appear, they're talking with Jesus about his death, Luke tells us. And Peter, James, and John see this. And now Jesus is back down the mountain. He heals the boy that was throwing himself in the water and the fire and all that, and delivers him of his demon. And then many others come to him. Great crowds begin to come to him while he's there. This is the last sermon he gives while he's in Perea, according to this chronology. And then someone shows up from Bethany and says, your friend Lazarus is very sick, nigh unto death, and his sisters Martha and Mary sent us to get you and bring you back there. And he's just told a story about a fellow named Lazarus who does die, is blessed in death, and there's an argument over whether Lazarus should come back from the dead or not and testify to others. Now, I know what you're smiling at. Oh, Brother Pat's going to try and convince us that these two Lazaruses are one and the same. That's nonsense. Well, I don't know if they were or not. I'm not trying to be convincing. I just want to stretch you into thinking about it. Here's what's interesting. The very next thing, according to this chronology of the New Testament, is that Jesus receives word, come back over to Jerusalem, to Bethany, and heal Lazarus. Jesus doesn't go. Then another messenger is sent out. Arrives saying to the first messenger, don't trouble the master, Lazarus has died. At this point, Lazarus has been dead about 2 days. Jesus waits another day and then travels with his disciples, as we will see when we get into the story of the raising of Lazarus. By the time Jesus arrives, Lazarus has been in the grave 4 days. And Jesus will show up. Later, after Jesus will raise Lazarus from the dead, within sight of the walls of Jerusalem, people on the walls of Jerusalem, it's not far to look over to that little grave from Jerusalem. You see, you can see Bethany from the walls of Jerusalem. Lazarus, the traditional place they have him buried and raised again, was in these places, these little cliffs down in the Kidron Valley where they made tombs. So that's not very far for people on the wall in Jerusalem to see Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. Later, just a week before Jesus is crucified, Jesus will go to Lazarus' house and spend the night there, and the next morning will ride the little donkey from Lazarus' house in Bethany through the Kidron Valley and up to the gates of Jerusalem, what they call the triumphant entry. But while the night before he's at Lazarus' house, not only is there a large crowd there to hear Jesus, but John tells us there are also many there who were there to hear Lazarus, who had been raised from the dead. That means Lazarus, after he got out of the dead for 4 days, in, shall we say, in the bosom of Abraham for 4 earth days, is called back to earth again to testify, which is exactly what the rich man in Jesus' parable asked for Lazarus to do. Y'all listening to what I'm saying? And whatever Lazarus has to say is so upsetting, not only to Pharisees, but to Sadducees as well, that the high priest Caiaphas, who himself is a Sadducee, Caiaphas calls a little council of secret assassins and says, we've got to find some way to kill Lazarus and keep him dead this time. Now, ain't that something? Yeah, right after. In other words, burn him up and throw his ashes down in Gehenna, in the split in the ground outside of Jerusalem. Pretty interesting to me. The other thing is, this is Lazarus and the rich man, what we're looking at here. It's the only parable Jesus tells that gives us a picture of the afterlife. You ever noticed that? Nowhere else do we have a picture of the afterlife. Later in Matthew 24 and 25, Jesus will tell his disciples about the great judgment, which appears to be in the afterlife, but maybe not, when he's dividing his sheep from his goats, you know, and all of this. Other than that, we don't have Jesus talking about the afterlife. In fact, one time he told his disciples, you don't understand when I tell you of earthly things. How then can I tell you of heavenly things? And the real translation would be, you don't understand when I discuss temporal things. How will you understand if I discuss eternal things with you? But here he does. He gives us a story, Lazarus and the rich man, saying it's a certain thing. Here's the guy's name. And Jesus says, and here's what he said, what he heard, what the dead rich man said in the afterlife. Wow, to bring us a conversation out of the afterlife and say it's a real story? Would Jesus do that if he didn't have a witness who was there and also saw and heard it? If you don't believe me, here's the guy, ask him. Now, that would mean, if this is one and the same Lazarus, that would mean that Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead actually occurred. And if I were following that theme for plausibility's sake, I would arrange it that way if I were putting together a chronology of the different events in the four Gospels. I would put it that the story of Lazarus and the rich man is something Jesus told after Lazarus was raised from the dead. If you don't believe me, here's the guy himself, Lazarus. He can tell you all about it. Now, that theory, and I've only got 2 or 3 more minutes. Is this interesting to you? That theory says, well, Lazarus had a house, and he had 2 sisters, and apparently a good house, because Jesus and all of his disciples went there to eat on a few occasions. How would he be a beggar on the street? Well, it can happen pretty quickly, you know. He comes down with some terrible disease. He's not a leper, so he's not driven away, but he is unclean. And being unclean, he can't go into his house anymore because he would contaminate the house and his sisters who dwelt there. And being unclean, he's not allowed to work anymore, so the family is falling into penury. And Lazarus is out begging. It's been perhaps a year since Jesus had been there. And this terrible misfortune could have happened to our great friend Lazarus. And in the past couple of months, he's been out begging for help for himself and for his 2 sisters. It could actually have happened. Once I was waiting in fortune and fame, had all I dreamed of to get ahead in life's game. But suddenly it happened. I lost every dime. I find I'm richer by far with a satisfied mind. You ever heard that old song? Yeah, I always liked it. Well, it can happen. We all like the rags to riches Cinderella type story, but there are also many riches to rags stories out there. And if that could have happened to Lazarus, I'm just asking, I'm not asking you to believe it or agree with it. I'm not sure I agree with it. I just think it's interesting that the story and the event of raising Lazarus from the dead happens within days of one another. I don't know which is first. If they're the same Lazarus, it seemed like raising Lazarus from the dead would happen first, and then Jesus would tell the story about it. Or maybe this guy has it right, Mr. Robertson, who put together this chronology. Maybe Jesus is telling this story before he has gone to raise Lazarus, while the messengers are on the way to tell him Lazarus is dead. Maybe Jesus knows that Lazarus is in Abraham's bosom, hearing the screams of the rich man, whose last appeal was, is there a way to send Lazarus back to warn my brothers? And Abraham saying, probably no need. Your brothers have Moses and the prophets. They can hear them. Even if one were raised from the dead, they wouldn't believe. Why would Jesus tell that story unless he's going to prove it? Lazarus is raised from the dead, and he's testifying to them what the afterlife is all about. Words, Lazarus' words reach the ears of the high priest, and he says, we got to kill that fellow. We've already been killed once. We got to do it again. Now, to me, that's an interesting scenario. I hope you found it so tonight also. Next time I speak on a Wednesday night, we'll indeed pick up with the details of John's account of the raising of Lazarus from the dead. Give Pastor James a hand as he comes.
Let's go ahead and stand to our feet. Not a lot of comment, but a matter of fact, if that place is real, how many of you know? If that place is real, we want to do all we can do to make sure no one goes there. Present Jesus Christ, the love of God, to everybody we possibly can, and that we ourselves not run in vain. Run and live this life as a witness for Him.